Hey everybody, welcome to another Ask Us Anything,
Hello.
where the title is self-explanatory. You ask us
Anything.
anything, preferably about the sermon or church or niche MBA questions, but we will accept anything as a category. So you have four questions that have been asked to us. Two of them are about the sermon specifically from last week on fasting, and two of them are about just more open-ended things about past sermons or general things. So without further ado, first question. It's actually two questions in one. The first question is a question we got asked last week, but we didn't answer it because it's probably going to be a short answer. And then they followed up with another question. So, first question, quote, "Hi, please take this. Hello.
Hello.
Please take this question as open curiosity, not a critique or a complaint in any way. I'd like to know, why haven't we addressed the season of Lent during church? What are your thoughts about Lent? Parentheses. Apologies if we did talk about it in the church and I missed it. Part two of the question. Morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
This is the Lent question asker again.
It is
Hello.
morning actually right now too,
It is true.
as we're recording this. So
Hello, Lent question asker again. Just popping in to say how well I missed, or no, how well my question about practicing Lent fits in with the sermon on fasting. That is true.
that's
God's
very true.
providence strikes again. Lent is, in some ways, an opportunity to corporately fast with other Christians across denominations and countries. Also, a quick note, I know you mentioned medical restrictions for fasting, diabetes, pregnancy, but it's also important to note that eating disorders are another medical restriction. Folks with a history of disordered eating should
Hmm.
not fast from food as it could be triggering.
It's very true.
There are other ways to fast. Thank you. End quote. So, Derek, Lent 1 and 2.
Yeah.
What say you?
Well, I think it's a great question, and it certainly wasn't intentional that we didn't talk about or discuss Lent. Um, we do try to, in many respects, observe and follow the church calendar. It's something that we try to remind ourselves of, especially um, around important seasons of the year like Christmas and Easter. Now, Lent, historically, and I think you're going to talk more about some of this in a second, but Lent historically has been something that, at least in a lot of Protestant traditions, hasn't been quite as focused on. I'm not saying we made that as an intentional decision. As a church, it basically was more just we were busy kind of focusing on and making announcements about other things. But I think Lent is absolutely a great season of life, even as this question asker says or makes the statement about it's a good opportunity to fast with people corporately in other arms or aspects of the church. So definitely very true. But there have been certain abuses that are seen certainly within the Catholic side of the church, but also I would even say within some Protestant
Hmm.
areas of the church. Like one just kind of quick note historically, Mardi Gras is when it is, in particular, so that everybody can theoretically go and do all the fun stuff that they want to before they enter into a series or the season of Lent. Again, I'm not saying that we try to in any way, shape, or form diminish Lent or ignore it because of that. So there was no intention on our part as to not mentioning it or something like that. It was just something we just didn't get around to, as Nacho Libre would say.
I was about to say, you sound like you're quoting Nacho Libre.
I was quoting
Never got
Nacho
your
though
lines.
without the accent.
Of
But
course.
why don't you talk a little bit more about some of the
Hmm.
maybe the historical expressions of Lent and the way that maybe it's been abused. So
Yeah, I think that we're totally open. I mean, we don't want to speak on behalf of all of the elders. We haven't talked about it, but maybe this question is a good prompter to a discussion among the elders, like to uh, more specifically talk about Lent, but even more broadly to revisit how do we want the church calendar to play a role in the life of the church, because to some degree we're already doing that. We all celebrate Easter. We're going to be doing some stuff for Holy Week in a couple weeks, and we do Advent. But there is, I think, a helpful place for the church calendar and how it really disciples us and shapes us more and more. And I think that we could probably, as a church, lean into that more.
mm,
That being said, I do think it's it's good to just acknowledge some of the, I don't want to say dangers of Lent, but like, what would be a good way to put it?
Abuses,
Yeah,
maybe.
some past oversteps that the church calendar has played. And again, like Charles Taylor talks about this in A Secular Age, that in the medieval time, they would have this, I never heard of this before, but this concept called carnival, where it sounds fun, but it was literally just people in the medieval period, you know, I don't remember when it started. I think the late 1100s, if I'm not mistaken, like would just go hard in the paint, like partying and doing crazy stuff. Like think a couple steps down from the purge. I'm not 100% sure if that was right before Lent. I don't remember what Taylor said, but he said there was this category of like you get everything out, you know, sin wise, you know, just kind of just and
indulge the flesh.
yeah, and the priests were like okay with it. He was like, all right, go for it. And Mardi Gras, I think, was the French expression of it.
Right.
French Catholics. I could be wrong. Again, I'm
Yep.
not, don't quote any of us on this history.
I think that's
I didn't
right,
do a lot
though,
of
for
research
Mardi
for
Gras.
this one. But I remember Taylor talks about that in A Secular Age. And I know enough to know the reformers did talk about the reason why I think, I shouldn't say I know enough. I vaguely remember the reformers not being as big on Lent, a lot of them at least, the magisterial reformers, because they kind of said all of life should be Lent, meaning like, you know, Martin Luther's famous phrase, all of life should be one of repentance. And they were responding to the particular abuse of let's party hard before Lent and then let's give up something specific in Lent, but then never give up something the other times of the year. And Luther and Calvin came along and said, well, you know, actually, we really need to be repenting and have fasting more than just this particular time of year during Lent. This should be a whole life thing. That makes it so I totally sympathize with the reformers, and I do think I'm totally against the view in some sectors of the medieval Catholic Church. I don't think any Catholic worth their stones would like say carnival is okay today. That was a very medieval thing.
Right.
But there are still some. I remember talking to someone in our church from Latin America, and she was saying that I can't remember the name of it, but there is a holiday in Brazil to this day. Like I think it's a week long, or again, I should have researched this before, but where they still do that before Lent, where everybody just parties hard. And so, if Lent is going to lend itself to that, by all means, let's not do it. But abuse should not negate the helpful use of the practice. So I think we could learn, you know, there's a specific focus on corporate fasting, on corporate withdrawal, if you will, on corporate repentance that we could focus on only if we understand that we need to keep those elements going throughout the year. In a similar way that we have a specific focus on waiting for Jesus's return and Advent. But that doesn't mean that we should never look forward to his return the rest of the year. So yeah, I think we should do Lent, but we should do it in a balanced way. It's kind of all my thoughts on it.
One of the things that even just as you were sharing kind of a little bit of the historical practices and even some of what the magisterial reformers were kind of looking at and trying to, in some way, shape, or form, shape more towards a what I guess I would call more of a gospel-centered and whole life vision for pursuing holiness. One of the other things I wonder if was implicit within more of the Catholic and specifically the medieval practice of Lent was almost like if you party really hard before Lent, and then you give something up during Lent, again, I'm not saying this is why they did it, but I wonder kind of just in general, based upon other aspects of medieval Catholic theology, I wonder if part of the idea behind the medieval practices was, hey, because you did all of that bad stuff before Lent, now you need to work it off.
Right.
And so in one sense, Lent became very meritorious, or at least it could have become very meritorious in the medieval Catholic Church, which certainly the understanding of merit is the very thing that a lot of the reformers were going specifically after.
Yeah.
Right? You don't earn your salvation, and so you can't try to balance the scales, if you will, over a period of Lent.
Right.
Leading up to and ending on Easter Sunday. You can't do that. And I think that any practice, even if in the Protestant tradition, if you embrace the practice of Lent, kind of like I mentioned in the sermon on fasting, you're not doing it for meritorious purposes.
Right.
You're not doing it to try to get God's attention in any way, shape, or form, or try to earn something from Him. In doing it, it's actually a response to just His goodness and Him being our satisfaction.
Yeah.
And so it's a completely different framework in one sense too. So
That's a good point. And I think one thing, the second part of the question, I don't know if you want to add anything to this, but, and again, I'm saying this more as a pastor and not as a medical person. So I could be wrong. I could be wrong with anything, but I could really be wrong here. Like with people, so the three conditions, diabetes, pregnancy, I think you mentioned nursing,
Yeah.
and this person helpfully added eating disorders.
totally, very true.
I don't know if this is a possibility, but I think some people forget to realize that like fasting can be for a short period of time too. Like I think sometimes we think fasting only counts if it's for 24 hours, and that's not true. Like you can do a meal. Now again, it's up to you, and talk to your doctor if even one meal is too much. Like for I don't know enough to know like if that's okay for pregnant women and nursing people and people with eating disorder. I don't know enough about each of those things.
Yeah.
But just something to add, and again, I don't know if this is okay medically, so I say this with fear and trembling, is like things like the Daniel fast. Like, what is the Daniel fast? I know like what it's a fruits and vegetables.
Yeah.
No meat.
No meat.
Okay. Yeah. So
no wine.
There are different types of fast. Like you could go without sugar, or you could go without.
You can go without coffee.
Yeah. Don't push. That's our idol. But yeah, those are just other things.
I have done that a couple times. It's hard.
Yeah,
but you can do it.
So if you want to do food, but I'd like to this person's helpful point and your point, like you can't do all kinds of food. There are some things, but again, talk to your doctor. I'm not your doctor. Right. Okay, that's that question.
Well, one other thing that I would just add, kind of along those same lines, and I tried to mention this, and maybe it didn't come out very clearly on Sunday, but especially if you're just starting with fasting, you probably shouldn't fast from everything the first time that you do it. So you probably should consider more of like a Daniel fast, fruits, vegetables, or at least like smoothies. Yeah. So fasting from solid foods, things that you would typically eat, but taking some kind of nourishment in terms of fruit juice or smoothie, so that you can kind of manage through the hanger pains the first few times that you do it, and you begin training or disciplining your body. Because again, even to what you were alluding to a second ago, and what fasting is kind of focused on, is teaching us to find our provision, our sustenance, and our delight in God and in who He is and in His provision for us. And so you don't have to fast from everything, all foods, right? Like it's going to be enough, even if you're drinking fruit juice throughout the day, it's going to be enough when you miss breakfast to remind yourself as you're drinking fruit, like, right, I'm fasting from food today because God, I want you to be more of my provision. I want to find more of my delight in you. And that's still, I mean, it's a horrible way of saying it, but it still counts. Right. That's not even the right way of even framing it, but like you can still teach your flesh and your heart what it needs to learn through doing something like that.
For sure. For sure. Second question. Thanks, Derek, for the sermon.
You're welcome.
Derek. Nice. Such a great reminder to take the time to fast. I especially resonated with the idea that you don't fast to get God's attention because you already have it, but allow Him to get yours. So my question is, this person is saying, I have a tendency of replacing one vice for another without even realizing it until after. Same. For instance.
Thanks for your honesty there.
Thank you, person. I won't go on For instance, I won't go on Insta, but will play games. We'll skip dessert, but we'll do something else to fill that void, which I guess shows the addiction. LOL. I always wonder if when people say LOL, if they're actually laughing out loud or not.
Right.
But anyway, which I guess shows the addiction is there something you guys recommended in order to stay visual, intentional, and aware of the need to seek God in those moments instead of replacing addiction? I think I skipped a sentence. Oh, I did. Oh, okay. I combined two sentences.
I think
what would you recommend?
Yeah. I think
is there something you would recommend?
Like a question mark.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Is there something you guys would recommend in order to stay vigilant, intentional, and aware of the need to seek God in those moments instead of replacing the addictions? I missed the end of the sentence there.
Yeah, I think so. A couple things I would say, two things in particular, and I think I mentioned both of these on Sunday. But I think one of the things that I would encourage you to do is when you're fasting, or um, maybe even including, even as the person's question implies, some other form of abstinence, like abstaining from social media or video games or television, whatever. Um, One of the things that I think it's always appropriate to do in this time that helps with intentionality and vigilance is to utilize passages of scripture that talk about finding your satisfaction in God alone.
Hmm.
Or maybe to use the flip side of that, utilize passages of scripture that talk about your hunger and thirst for God.
Hmm.
So Psalm 42, 43, 63, Psalm 16. Those are a handful of ones that I would encourage you maybe to go to. Deuteronomy 8, which Jesus quotes when he's going through his fast. Or maybe even just reading Matthew 4, the beginning of Matthew 4, where Jesus is fasting and tempted by the devil to turn the stones into bread.
Hmm.
Um, John 4, John 6, John 8, John 7, even, where Jesus is doing teaching on him satisfying people, him being the bread of life that's come down from heaven. We use some of those passages actually in our call to worship, and then also in our assurance of pardon this last week. But those would be some things that I think help keep you vigilant and intentional. And then, of course, prayer goes hand in glove with the reality and the experience or expression of fasting or abstinence. I think that protects you, or it's aimed at protecting you
Hmm.
from substituting one form of distraction with another. Because again, the whole purpose. This is another way that maybe I would talk about fasting. Fasting is a physical means by which you put pressure on your renewed heart. I've mentioned this before in other contexts, but we cannot directly affect our hearts. Only God can do that, right? He alone has the power to take out the heart of stone and put in a heart of flesh.
Hmm.
He alone has the power to prevail by his Holy Spirit upon the heart. He can work inside out, right? Even Philippians 2 kind of gets at that we work out what God is working in
Hmm.
according to his will and pleasure. So what we have to do is we have to work outside in.
Hmm.
We take bodily disciplines, which are spiritual disciplines, because all spiritual disciplines are bodily.
Sure.
Right? You can't read the Bible or pray without your mind, without your eyes, without, other bodily resources, right? And fasting, I think, is a physical means to put pressure on the renewed heart.
Hmm.
But going hand in glove with that I think keeps us vigilant, is prayer.
Hmm.
And beginning to literally turn your mind's attention in order that you can direct your heart's affection to God. You want to utilize prayer and fasting,
Yeah.
or fasting and prayer and passages of scripture. So that's just some practical things I think about.
I think to that point about spiritual disciplines really shape your heart through your body. Like God is, the subject, and the means are the spiritual disciplines through your body to your heart, because your heart is the center of who you are, and what you love shapes everything about you. I think another implication of that is, and this should be an encouragement to the person and to all of us, there are times, I would maybe even argue a lot of the time, where you won't know that you're being changed.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm emphasizing the word know,
True.
because you may not, like, your sanctification may never cross through your mind. Again, I'm emphasizing the word mind, meaning that if the center of who you are is your heart, and what you love shapes everything about you, and what you worship shapes everything about you, there may be things that you love that you don't even know you love, that are happening at a subconscious level. I think this is like some of the things that Freud was actually onto, but he just kind of said it in a less true way than Augustine did.
Right.
Like, We're fundamentally loving creatures. Now, again, a practical implication of that is you may fast and be really discouraged in the next day because you're like being a modern Western person in a hyper productivity culture. Say, I need tangible ways in which I grew in that fasting, and you may never see them,
Right.
or at least you may not see most of them. You may feel the same way this is not just for fasting, this is prayer. There may be visceral heart changes to your life that you yourself may never see.
Yeah.
Or you may never at least consciously recognize. It's kind of like if you're losing weight or something, you probably won't see it, but someone else who sees you every 4 months may see it because they're like, oh, you've changed.
Right.
So it's happening gradually and it's happening below the surface, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And so just to encourage like someone, if you're like, I'm focusing on fasting and it's really hard and I don't really feel anything that's being done. It's like God's doing the work.
Yeah.
You just may not know it. You may not see it. Another thing I would say is that when you feel that discomfort, lean into it.
Yeah.
Really sit with it. We live in one of the only cultures ever that you have a billion different ways to cope and numb the pain that you're in. Like, what culture in the previous society is like, think about how many TV shows you could possibly watch at any given moment.
Yeah.
Think about how many things you could look up on the internet at any given moment. Think about all the video games, and there's billions of ways to distract yourself
Right.
at any given time from anywhere, like music, anything. And so it takes a higher level of discipline in our society because you can't even go pee today without being like, you have the freedom to check your email as you're going pee.
That's true.
There's no society in history like before 20 years ago that you could like multitask using the bathroom.
That's right.
Or doing the dishes and listen to a podcast. And I'm not saying all these things are wrong. It's not a sin to, check your Gmail while you're peeing. But not as if I've done that. TMI, right? But I do think like we all have a tendency like, oh, I'm going to do the dishes and vacuum. Let me put on a podcast. While those things aren't wrong per se, it is a good way, or it is not a good way. It is a way that we're numbing ourselves and we're not leaning into the discomfort. So lean into it. Have some time in your day that you're not on or pouring into yourself, but you have built-in spaces in your day, particularly when you're fasting, when you're praying, that you feel uncomfortable and you're like, I don't really know what to do about this. Lean into it, because oftentimes we suppress pains or memories or idols or sin, and we need time for to give God to move. Not that he can't move when we're busy, but we need prolonged periods of withdrawal and silence and solitude and fasting. And of course you're going to have these moments where you're like, oh, I need to fill that with some void, because we have the most dopamine addicted society in history. Yeah. And there's a physiological component to that's very much coinciding with the spiritual component of like, I need to have my dopamine fix, whether it's on Instagram or with sugar or with a podcast or even just stupid YouTube videos about cats. Like, there's a billion different ways to do it, but lean into it and really ask hard questions when you feel discomfort. Why am I discomforted right now? Am I hiding from something in my past? Yeah. Am I hiding from some form of shame I feel with something I said the other day? And really lean into your own evil and brokenness and God's grace for that particular element there. Just make more time. We live in such distracting moments. Another area to do this is Sabbath. Have a whole day where you do this. I wouldn't recommend, I don't know about you, this is a personal thing. This is I, not the Lord. I wouldn't fast on the Sabbath because it's kind of like you're with the bridegroom. Feast on the Sabbath. Yep. I wouldn't try to put all of your disciplines of abstention. What is the word I'm blanking on?
Abstention, yeah. On
the same day.
That's right.
Sabbath is a different kind of abstention than fasting. I'd space those out. That's just a personal recommendation.
I agree with that. And one of the things I think that highlights, and I think the more that you get into the habit of fasting too, the more, strangely enough, you begin cultivating another discipline, which is actually a discipline of engagement. And that's the discipline of thanksgiving.
Sure.
Because you realize after you fast, especially if you're fasting from food, but like I would even say if you're abstaining from watching TV or playing video games or something like that, when you go back to those things, hopefully you will go back to them in more of a Godward direction.
Sure.
You
Your
know,
love's ordered.
that's right. With your loves ordered and with an understanding, like with food, for example, that you literally do not provide for yourself,
Right.
but that we do actually receive our sustenance from God. Psalm 145:16 says, "He opens his hand and he satisfies the desires of every living thing."
Hmm.
Um, and I think that as you do without something, you actually heighten your awareness of the flip side of that coin too.
Right.
And so back to your point about the Sabbath and feasting on the Sabbath, that is a discipline too.
Right.
Um, Now, again, one place that I would just say maybe, draw the line when it comes to this idea of feasting. Some people would be like, sweet, so that means I can just practice gluttony
Right.
at some point. That's not what I said. Feast, like invite friends over, have a good meal together, celebrate the goodness of God together, but don't eat until you're stuffed. Don't overdrink. Right? I mean, the Bible is very clear on what it speaks about with regard to alcohol.
Yeah.
Do not get drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit. Paul says in Ephesians 5:18. But you can practice those things in moderation to the glory of God. So Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10, whether you eat or you drink, you do all to the glory of God. And it's the same thing with fasting. You could put that in that same category. Paul could have just as easily said, if you don't eat or you don't drink, do that to the glory of God. But the goal, whether fasting or feasting, is to begin helping train your heart through some kind of physical
Hmm.
practice
Right.
to live Godward.
Yeah. And that speaks to the point of we are not, as James K. Smith has said, we're not brains on sticks.
That's right.
And so there may be, oftentimes we know theoretically that God is our portion, but our bodies don't know it.
That's right.
Our hearts don't know it. And that's not to say we're dualistic, Gnostic, like your body is against your mind. But there are different components to a human being. And in order to get something into your gut, you got to do it with your body. You don't just need to read it.
That's right.
So fasting gets into your body and maybe your whole person, something that you've read that can't really get down in there. So to feasting, a clarifying question there, or let me say what I'm hearing you say, and you tell me if what you're saying is right.
Sure.
Feasting is different from a normal, ordinary meal.
Mm-hmm.
Insofar as you're really slowing down, you're taking time, the meal is not just about let me eat this so I can continue with the rest of the day. It is not a means to an end, it is an end.
That's right.
But it's different from gluttony insofar as gluttony is really about the quantity of food and about your heart position toward food.
That's right.
Like a lack of self-control. So it's not like the feast is like, let's eat until we get sick and throw up.
Right.
Like I think it's the Hunger Games where the people take those pills or whatever so they can throw up and eat more food. District 1 or something.
It's been a long time since I've watched
I know, it's like high school brain trying to remember the Hunger Games. So it's not saying that, but it's more about the time and why you're eating. Is that the feasting component? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I would say too that I think that's a great clarification. And even
because it is a spiritual discipline.
It is.
Right.
Feasting is a discipline. It's a discipline of engagement. And I would even say, hopefully, again, as you fast and as you feast more Godwardly, it actually does begin to change just your everyday meal, right? When you're at your desk eating during the lunch hour, because what you will begin seeing, and this goes back to one of the things that the first time you fast, your point of I may not see God doing anything in that immediate experience, but over the course of time, I think you begin to realize I need to bow my head and give thanks to God even as I'm about to eat this quick meal sitting at my desk because God has provided for me.
Yeah.
And so your disciplines of fasting and feasting begin to change your everyday.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that, again, over the course of time, very slowly will help you. I would encourage you, if you haven't ever read even just the chapter in Richard Foster's book, Celebration of Discipline, on fasting, he talks about that. And even to your point on seeing the incremental changes that can begin to happen, he talks a little bit about that. So, but I'll just commend that to you.
It's a great counter. Both fasting and feasting are both counter formative practices and feasting counteracts food is just a means to an end. You are about productivity.
That's
Feasting
right.
is like, no, people, as C.S. Lewis says at the end of the Way to Glory sermon, you've never met a mere
You're
mortal.
mortal. That's right.
Enjoy food. Food is good, but fasting combats. You need food in order to be satisfied. You need food to cope with pain. And it's saying, no, God is my true and ultimate portion. So they're great practices to implement,
Yeah.
not just in general, but to counter catechize our hearts away from the rhythms of this world. Third question. How do you answer someone when they offer you a meal during a fast?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I think this is super practical. Two ways. And I think you have to allow wisdom and even kind of the Spirit of God to dictate and encourage to you how you should do it. I know that the Benedictines, we were talking about this even just before we started the podcast, but the Benedictines, if someone was in the middle of a fast and they found out that a visitor was coming over, they would break their fast and they just wouldn't make a big deal out of it.
Right.
And I think you can do that.
Yeah.
If someone offers you a meal and you feel like, you know what, this actually may be a good opportunity for me to connect with this person, break the fast and do it another day, right?
Yeah.
It's not that big of a deal. It's not like you're disappointing God, because again, remember, it's not meritorious, right?
Yeah.
You're training your heart, and you can train your heart just as well tomorrow or the next day as you can today. Now, that being said, don't forever and always put off fasting, right? At some point, engage the discipline. But that's one option. The other option is just be honest.
Yeah.
And say, I'm fasting right now. Would you mind if we ate another day? Or, you can eat, I won't. And that's hard, right? Like it's hard to sit across the table from somebody while they're eating something good and
I have a funny story about that.
you not eat. But it is possible. So I would say that. But what I would say is don't lie.
Yeah.
Don't feel like, again, just let your yes be yes and your no be no. And you're not coming back to Jesus' teaching. Don't be legalistic about this. Don't use his statement about this idea of fasting before the Father in secret to lead you to the sin of lying. Oh, I'm not hungry right now, and just leaving it at that.
You're like clearly hungry.
Yeah, you're starving. Your
I
stomach
hate
is
food.
growling.
I never liked food.
Right.
I don't want to eat lunch ever again.
Just be honest. You're not making a show of your fast in that moment.
Right.
It's a posture of the heart, right?
So it kind of, a lot of that I think stems down to understanding what Jesus meant a few passages earlier for don't let your right hand know what your left hand's doing. It's not saying never let anybody know when you give or pray or fast. It's saying, again, don't do it for the purpose of being seen. But if someone sees you because they ask you to a meal, or for the sake of, or for the example of giving, it's not wrong to report to the IRS that you gave money to a church and claim it for tax purposes. At least I don't
Right.
think it is. I think that's wise. It's
Right.
stewarding of your money. It's
Right.
saying let's
Do that if
Yeah.
you
Do
don't
it.
do it.
let the government get less money and use it for your family. My inner libertarian's coming. Anyway, it's saying don't walk down the streets and be like, hey everybody, guess who's fasting today? Humble fast, humble brag. But yeah, just be honest with people. It's not the end of the world. I may be awkward for half a second if someone's like, hey, you want to grab lunch? And maybe tomorrow, dude, I'm fasting.
Yeah.
It's not a big deal. You're not going to hell if you do that. On the flip side, I think just a practical point here is set up a day or a time that you routinely fast so that if you're fasting on Tuesdays or whatever, don't schedule a lunch meeting then. But
Yeah.
if an unexpected one comes up, then fast. If you have a work meeting that you have to eat, make a judgment call, but then have a backup day. Okay, this is my backup fasting day.
Right.
I once, Brenna, and I think she had a friend come, and it was one of the first times I'd ever fasted. It was I was struggling. I was really struggling.
So
it was 2 p.m, and I was like, Lord, my pitiful self. And Brenna, she didn't know I was fasting, and she brought home a large amount of Chick-fil-A. And I was just the Lord is calling me to end this fast right now. I couldn't do it. So that's not an example to follow. It's just to say sometimes it's okay.
It is, and I
And
do
especially if it's for Chick-fil-A, because
yeah,
I'm the Lord's calling me to feast right now.
Well, and
I
again,
can't say no. It's like, rise, Peter, kill and eat. Like,
I think that, what this does, it also highlights maybe another thing that this question kind of gets practically too, that you just highlighted. If you're going to have a day where you typically fast, think about your schedule that day. Because again, there are going to be some practical things you're going to need to do, right? Like you may not be able to work out as hard, like if that's part of your typical routine.
yeah, don't run a marathon on the day you're fasting.
Definitely don't do that. Don't schedule a lunch meeting or a breakfast meeting, of course. But the other thing that you could also do, and this even gets back to this idea of the right hand, left hand, who do you tell? How do you handle it? If you know that, like if you're married and, your spouse typically makes dinner or you typically make dinner for your family, it's probably good to go ahead and tell your family that you're going to fast that day.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that at all.
So that, they don't make this intricate meal, or they're not counting on you making some intricate meal and then they turn up and you're not eating, right?
Right.
Because that can be pretty frustrating too. But that's not doing, it's not doing what the Pharisees would do, announcing to other people that you're fasting for the sake of your own reputation, right? You're doing it. You want to do it for the right reason.
Totally.
So.
Good stuff. All right, last question. In the recent sermon about divorce, so this is going back a couple weeks, the term law of concession was used to describe certain laws and practices for a hardened heart. What are some of the other examples in the Bible of this type of law besides divorce?
Yeah, so to remember, or to put this into context, the definition, and if I remember right, Craig Keener was the one that it wasn't just him. John Stott actually used the phrase law of concession as well. But the definition that Keener gave, pretty sure it was Keener that gave it, was it's something that God regulates that was not God's intention from the beginning. So it's God's concession, if you will, to regulate in one way, shape, or form life not the way that it's supposed to be, or life post-fall. And so again, we talked about how divorce is that way. And you see this law of concession going back to Jesus's own language there. The Pharisees said, Moses, why did Moses then give us a command to give a certificate to our wives if we want to divorce them? And Jesus said, it was not that way from the beginning. So that's where this idea of concession comes in. And it was actually due to the hardness of your heart that God permitted that. And then Jesus says, do you not remember, or have you never read, that a man shall leave his father and mother, cleave unto his wife? So again, God's intention around marriage, for example, is that it would be husband and wife for all of life. That was God's intention from the beginning. Due to the hardness of human hearts, due to sinfulness, God regulates something so that sin doesn't get as bad as it could. That's in essence what a law of concession is, or would be. Other examples of that that I can think of, and I've never come across like a list. So these are just things that I've been thinking of ever since I got the question. But one would be like in the Old Testament, if you've ever run into in parts of Exodus or Leviticus, places where there's some kind of regulation over what happens if someone steals from you, what your response should be, or if your ox gores another ox, right?
It happens every week.
Right. Some of these things, they seem kind of funny to us, but another law of concession that we were just talking about before we jumped on the podcast might be the idea even of a city of refuge. This was one that you brought up that I think is a good one. It was never God's intention for people to kill one another. And so if there was an involuntary murder or death, you get in a fight, you hit somebody, they get hit with a rock, or they fall and hit their head on a rock in a fight and they die, you could flee to a city of refuge. But again, from the beginning, we were created in the image of God. And even in Genesis 9, God very clearly says, you shouldn't take the life of another person because I created you in my image.
Right.
and even laws of retaliation, therefore. So cities of refuge are kind of within the realm of laws of retaliation. And again, there's even a distinction here between, like, if an individual were to kill another individual, in the Old Testament, there were certain stipulations around what that family of the murdered person could do.
Right.
So I'd say those are laws of concession. And that's a different category than what the government could do.
Sure.
Right? Or civic law. But that's kind of how some of those things would maybe be situated in the midst of that. And one of the other things, and I know this is maybe a hot button topic, especially as we hear it or think about it today, but I would actually put slavery into this category. And as I say that, let me just say that when the Bible talks about slavery, it is not ever condoning slavery as it was practiced or conceding to slavery as it was practiced in Europe and the Americas. It is never condoning that. It is never conceding to that as a practice. Slavery, as described in the Bible, was what we might think of in our understanding of history as like indentured servitude. It was based on indebtedness. It was not based upon race. And again, historians all over the place would agree with this. The Bible does not condone slavery under any circumstances as it was practiced in Europe and America, based on race.
Right, like especially the man stealing, which
Right.
is like condemned. Yeah.
Which is
it wasn't about
exactly
stealing. It was about like most of the time it was volunteer.
right.
It was like I either become a cultic prostitute or I become a slave to a landowner.
Right. Because I'm indebted, right? Or I can't pay my bills, and the only way that I can do that lawfully was by becoming an indentured servant, or what is biblically referred to as a slave. The other way, biblically, that a person could oftentimes become a slave is through being captured. So if one country went into another one, if Israel went into a country and overtook that country, those that would be let out and who lived like from the army or just from the general population, they would enter into a period of slavery. But here's the crazy thing, and this is why I think this fits into the category of law of concession. Israel was always supposed to release captives in the 7th year. Always.
Right.
Always. And actually, there's another law of concession around what would happen if in that 7th year, if that servant, indentured servant, or again, biblically slave, said, I don't want to go free. If that person, and I think that's in Deuteronomy 17.
It's the ear thing.
It's the ear thing, yeah. You would become what is called a bondservant at that point. And the ear thing that Nathaniel is talking about, if in that 6th year, you're supposed to let the indentured servants go free, whether they were your servants because of indebtedness or they were your servants because they were captured. In the 7th year, you were to let them go free, and you were also to send them away with everything that they would need to start their life as freed people. So you send them with tools for whatever work, farming work they needed to do. You send them with a portion of your livestock, a portion of your grain. And as a matter of fact, in our passage for this week, which we're going to be talking about treasure and storing up treasures in heaven, there's this interesting phrase that comes from Deuteronomy 15, and it's in that same context of setting slaves free, where Jesus quotes and he says, don't let your eye be stingy, or don't let your eye be evil. And that comes from this same idea. Sometimes when the year of release was being practiced, evidently, some Israelites were like, well, I don't want to give everything that I should give to these people. I don't want to give them tools. They need to get their own. I don't want to give them, some of my animals. They need to get their own. I don't want to give them some of the grain. They need to get their own. And Jesus would call that being having an evil eye. That's the language in Deuteronomy. So this idea of practicing release, practicing generosity, again, it fits into this law of concession. It was never God's intention that another person would actually need to be a servant to another human being, right? We're all created in the image of God, equal. But because of the fallenness of the world, because of the way that indebtedness works, because of the way that war works, um, God God put regulations around this practice,
Hmm.
so that there would always be something that would protect or limit the kind of wickedness or sinfulness that human beings were capable of. So those would be some of the examples that just again come to mind as I think about Scripture.
And almost, I think all of them to some degree, it's not like they're abolished in the sense of like the Lord changed his mind, but they were context specific, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like with slavery, it's not to say, all right, you can have a slave if you want, or you can still get divorced if you want. It was saying in that specific time, there wasn't really, especially in the Roman time, Greco-Roman context, there wasn't really an alternative for many people to slavery.
That's right.
And again, it's more almost more similar to being a normal employee today than it
That's right.
is to like definitely closer to that than, you know, 19th century race-based chattel slavery.
That's right. And
But that doesn't mean that slavery is okay. It means
exactly.
like, okay, the Roman system is doing it. Here's how you do it well. And I don't know, there's to some degree, we all have laws of concession today.
Mm-hmm.
Like we may say plastic is not ideal, but is it sinful for you to go to a grocery store that there's plastic? No. I mean, like single use plastic is not ideal, but again, it's like there's kind of there's a notion in which if you live in the modern world, you're going to in some way something you own is probably not made in the most ethical way. It doesn't mean you need to be laissez-faire about everything.
Right.
It just means that you need to do your best to be ethical and apply the gospel in every area of your life. But to try to say I need to go perfectly without any form of concession is naive. You see this in the show The Good Place. Like I don't want to spoil the ending, but they kind of one of the things they point out is like you're inadvertently supporting evil in almost everything you do,
Mm-hmm.
no matter what. So again, that doesn't mean you be lazy and apathetic about it. It does mean though that like I think some of that principle of law of concession applies to life in a modern secular context. It's like you're not called to abstain from participating in any kind of system. You're called to do what you can with the time that is given to you, to do as much as you can in your sphere of influence. But if the government, implements some policy that's against what God wants, it doesn't mean that like you need to abdicate your American citizenship because by being an American citizen, I don't know, you can't ever be fully pure.
That's right.
You need to do what you can. I don't know. I don't know if that's a fair pulling from the principle of law of concession, but to say, that's just to say that some of those laws are obsolete now, the concessions, but maybe
Right.
we can apply some of those principles today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's good.
Well, those are all the questions we have received, but we'd invite you to keep sending them in. We love doing this. And
Indeed.
hopefully you find some of our musings helpful. We love you guys and thankful for your listening.
See you next time.
Peace.